From Jim Bidzos, and I'm thinking back to the days when everything was getting started in public key cryptography and the public key cryptography standards. And I suppose it was a lot like what's going on here today, except no one had laptops back then to put on their desktop. No one was online sharing anything. We weren't putting any of the materials up on the web after we were done. This was 1991, after all. There were somewhat fewer number of people, and everything was distributed in bound volumes or by fax. But other than that, it was very similar to what's happening here today. But the important part on all this is that people were working together to solve a common problem. So we're at a point in time in 1991 when the public key cryptography standards, PKCS, were first developed. That's about 15 years after the invention of public key cryptography, the Diffie-Hellman paper, the RSA algorithm in 1978. And things are still slow moving at that point. There's some networked communications and some specialized applications. And when you're communicating securely, you're using symmetric key cryptography. A few of the ideas had circulated already around how we would put public key cryptography in place and how things could get better if we did that, but those were very limited. And yet, people who were interested in deploying public key cryptography, who saw the benefits in the long term, recognized the need for interoperability, especially if you're getting outside your own environment. And that's one of the reasons that you'd want to do public key cryptography. You want to be sure you're doing it the same way that the other parties are. I don't think I need to review this for anybody, the RSA Public Key Crypto System, except that to remind you in the current way of thinking of things, it may be different than if you go back to the paper and see some of the terminology. So as we look at this nowadays, public key and private key, the modulus and the exponents, the public key crypto systems, the encryption of M, decrypting the ciphertext, signing the message, verifying the signatures. But in the papers themselves, the definitions are different because the worldview was somewhat different in the initial days. And that will play into what we had to do as we're putting together the standards that we came through in PKCS. One of the most recent publications in the PKCS series is version 2.2 of PKCS1, and this retains the same kind of descriptor as all the others. Specifications produced by RSA Laboratories, cooperation with secure systems developers worldwide. And this was the part I had the privilege of working in when Jim hired me going on 30 years ago, and Ron Rivest was founder of the company, and I was a student of Ron's, and so I think many of you can relate to that in your career paths of advisors and company founders, and some of you are the advisors and the company founders. And how do you figure this out? That you're trying to take this technology and put it in a form where you can write down a specification that other people can reference and implement. So this is what resulted in PKCS #1, version 2.2 in 2016, but that's how many years later than the very first one? That's 25 years and still getting published. So let's go back to the very beginning. So I'm going to tell you a few things in our time, and then we'll have some time for questions. So first, how did the specifications for RSA signatures get started? Then the specifications for RSA encryption, and then finally some lessons learned that I hope are transferable to what you all are doing. Now, I'll caveat that by saying what you all are doing here is so much more complex than what we were looking at in those early days, but maybe relatively speaking, we have the same ratios of the complexity to what happened beforehand. So we're starting out in a world of public key cryptography where people only knew symmetric key cryptography, and trying to make sense of how to put this in place. And so we'll start with RSA signatures. So going back to the original papers with Diffie-Hellman and RSA, you have this notion of public key cryptography, digital signatures being the reverse of each other. And in those papers, you'd find that the way you form a digital signature is not by signing with the private key, it's by decrypting with the secret key. Because after all, the public key encryption and digital signatures are interchangeable. You could use your decryption key either after something was encrypted, in which case you had the public key crypto system, or you could use it before anything had been decrypted. You just apply it directly to the message, and then it's reversed by applying the public key to encrypt. So some of that early terminology you'll see has decrypt with the secret key as one of the steps, and we'll see how that changed. But this is the original model, and there's some challenges with this model. One is that the message only has a certain maximum length to it. So if you ever wanted to encrypt something or sign something, in this case longer than that. You needed some other mechanism. And then secondly, people may not have realized at the beginning is they were dealing more than just a replacement for a block cipher, because the same diagram could apply. Maybe you'd start with encrypt rather than decrypt in a symmetric key cryptosystem. But there are all these other special properties. And as I've been attending the talks the last couple of days, I've seen how all of these properties of the mathematics are being used, like the homomorphic properties and the multiplicative and all the other interesting aspects. Those were extra surprises that came in the definitions of RSA that made it unconventional with respect to its use for encryption. So you had to think differently. Now, the standard model of RSA signatures through PKCS #1 has a very different structure than the one I just described, where the message goes directly into the decryption with secret key. It goes into the encryption with private key, but before it gets there, there's this block. Jim talked about the padding and formatting that we had to work about. So I thought I could do some archaeology on this. I imagine just about everybody here has implemented this, or you've debugged this, you've seen how this format works. You might just take it for granted. Some of you might have written proofs, some of you might have broken it already. But the idea that I look at here is, how did this come about? And it should give some examples as you're working through standardization. Why does this part fit next to that part and this thing we did and all the artifacts? We hope it was the best decision at the time, and I'll tell you how we got there. So there are 7 steps that we'll go through, and I'll walk these through in the subsequent slides. So the first of those steps is the obvious one. The messages need to be longer than the amount that can fit into the RSA modulus size. So the hash then sign paradigm is what became commonplace, that you took your message, you put it into a shorter hash value or a digest value. Because hash functions at that point were still non-cryptographic, for hashing, for database lookups, and so on. The hash term hadn't established itself yet the way it has today for cryptographic purposes, so the digest term was used alternatively. So this is why you have algorithms like MD245, message digest, and so on. And this was all brand new. So remember, we're coming out of the world of symmetric key cryptography. There wasn't a need to hash things down smaller. There was a need to do message authentication codes. If you had a secret key, you could then authenticate your message for the other party. In fact, we've rebuilt things like that with HMAC out of hash functions. But at that point, there wasn't an established way of making something shorter. Now, in the Diffie-Hellman paper, there is one example given of a hash type function that took a longer message, made it shorter, and that's suggesting that you use a symmetric key algorithm and let the message be the symmetric key and the plain text be a fixed value. And then surely it would be hard to invert that, because otherwise you could recover the symmetric key by seeing the plain text ciphertext pair. But that only had a fixed size, and you'd have to design a symmetric key algorithm with a longer input. So if you wanted something longer than that, special constructions were used. Juneman from IBM had a proposal that did modular squaring that was in standards documents briefly, and that would be able to produce something that would be full size. And then in a succession of publications from Davies and Price, from Merkel and some others, there was ideas suggested about applying block ciphers in certain ways. And so you'd have a DES-based approach, because we didn't have hash function building blocks, so we had to use DES at that point. But those would end up with a shorter sized output. And so this pattern emerged that you wanted to have these shorter digests coming out, not filling up the entire block. So this is before Bellaire-Rogueway's full domain hashing. If we had Bellaire-Rogueway's paper earlier on, we might have done away with all the internals of this block. It would just be the full domain hash. But this was still several years before that. The other reason for the digesting in this particular rate was the multiplicative structure of RSA. So in one of the earliest papers, DeVita wrote an analysis where he said that because of multiplicative structure of RSA, you could do some interesting chosen plaintext and chosen ciphertext attacks. And I think all of you know those textbook-wise. I want to get you to sign some message M, but I don't want you to know that I want you to sign M. So I'll send you M1 and M2, where M1 times M2 equals M. And so maybe you're willing to sign those. And then you get the signature back, and I can multiply the two things together. The clearest articulation from that era of the importance of having some kind of hash-based structure came from a paper by Dorothy Denning. And she observed the hash and sign paradigm as a way of breaking these attacks. She also noted some work by Judy Moore, who was at Sandia Labs at the time. And Judy had shown a even simpler version of the Davida attack, where she said, if you want somebody to sign a message, M for you, and not know what it is, then multiply M times R to the E as an attacker, and then they'll sign M times R to the E. It doesn't look like M. You get back the result, then you can get rid of the R, and now you have a signature. And that was the same concept that Chaum would later put into digital cash. So these multiplicative properties were out there, but they were kind of considered as attacks, things to be avoided, not to be taking advantage of. I'm glad people persisted, and we've got a lot of these used today in proving different properties. So we ended up at a point then where it was recognized that you wanted to hash first, you decide before you sign. We didn't have the tools to be able to hash to something that was the full size of the RSA modulus, the RSA keys being so large, relatively speaking, to compared to the hashes. And so we put it into a block and figure out what else goes in the block. So that's where that element came from the digest. Now, the algorithm identifier was another part of that formatting. And so I remember yesterday afternoon there was discussion about should we use ASN or JSON. Some of you were in the room for that, or XML. Well, ASN was the choice at this point because the X509 specification had just come out for directory authentication and included reference about RSA and had a number of other techniques that were based on RSA preliminary hash functions and so on, but one thing it had in there was this abstract syntax notation. So it made sense to build on that at the time. And the reason was that the hash functions were so new. It was just Rivest's MD2 had just appeared at this point in some specifications, that we thought that the set of hash functions would be changing rapidly. So you need some identifier to distinguish which hash function you're using. Unless you're 100% sure which hash functions are supported by the signer, the signer will be at risk of a signature algorithm, a hash algorithm being substituted. So you sign with one thing. If you don't have an algorithm identifier in your signature, someone says, no, they meant to sign with this hash function instead. And that means if one of these were to break, then you could claim that that was a legitimate signature. So putting the algorithm identifier, some would call this a hash function firewall, meant that you're committed to a specific algorithm in the signature. It's embedded in the bits. And again, it's something you can do when you have enough bits. So thinking of your design constraints, you might say, I've got bits, I can put them here. How will I use them? I get some protection. It was important at that period of time. And these algorithm identifiers were really long. They still are really long. Reason for that is that in the standards process, we didn't want to have a predefined list of all the algorithms. Some standards did that, and you'd say you have 1 byte, and you register algorithm 1, algorithm 2, algorithm 3. But we were so new in this, we said, let's leave it up to the implementation. And you can register algorithm identifiers through this other standards-based process. Just register it, drop it in, and it works. If you look ahead in some of the research, you find that this actually doesn't work so well in other algorithms besides RSA, because once you have existential forgery in your signatures, if your algorithm identifiers aren't all that long, you just do an existential forgery enough times until you get the algorithm identifier you want, and then go use the broken hash function. So just for this point in time. Now, the next part are all the paddings with these FFs, so lots of ones. That we were still in the transition from bits to bytes at that point, so it's good to put a lot of bits along just in case we decided we wanted to have a number of bits rather than bytes as the delimiters. But why do we end up padding this out? Early specifications sometimes only included the digest in the input. I mean, it seems to make sense. You've got this strong algorithm that just came out. You can put whatever you want into it to sign it. So why not just put the digest in directly? And Privacy Enhanced Mail had a spec like that. I don't know if there's any documentation on this attack, but I remember discussing it with Ron Rivest. I think we were Redwood Shores over dessert at some point at one of the meetings, and one of these writing on back of a placemat, right? Just handwriting, and Ron saying, you have to be careful about the following attack. Now, Desmet and Odlytsko had just published a new kind of attack on RSA signatures and encryption when the full message was the input. So remember, to the earlier one, David and then Moore had the approach where you factor the message into the two parts M1 times M2 and sign those, or take M times R to the E. What Desmet and Odlytsko showed is that instead of doing all this effort every message at a time, just go ahead and get the signer to sign a certain number of messages in advance, and then you can reuse those to sign anything else you want. And what you get the signer to do is effectively sign all of the small primes. So if you can convince the signer to sign 2 and 3 and 5 and so on, and you can do that by masking it in the technique Moore used. So there are these random things coming in, and they happen to be enough information for you now to find out the signatures on all the small primes. That means you can now determine the signatures on all the smooth numbers. And if you're lucky, the message you're trying to sign will be a smooth number. If it's not, just multiply it by R to the E for some random R. There's some chance it will be smooth. So the Desmet and Odlytsko attack was one more reason that you should hash, right? But when Ron was explaining this to me as we're designing this, he said it's really important that the input to the RSA operation, even when it has a hash, should be as long as the modulus. Because there's another kind of so-called index calculus attack. We have a note in PKCS number 1 about this attack, but I think it went like this. We didn't write down the details because we didn't want anybody to know, because there might be implementations out there that would already be vulnerable. So that was responsible non-disclosure at the time, which just said, here's why it's here. It's related to Desmet and Odlytsko. Here's how the attack went. So once you have put the digest in, you'd think, well, you can't get someone to sign primes for you anymore because the digest is unlikely to be a prime number. You'd have to keep trying it over and over again to get it to be a small prime. But it is likely that the digest will be a smooth number if you try enough digest, especially if the digest itself is small. So if it's a 128-bit digest that was typical at that time, there are going to be a lot of smooth numbers with respect to some smoothness bounds in your 128-bit digest. So the attack goes as follows. Choose messages that the signer actually might be willing to sign, make some plausible variations in them, spaces, punctuation, and so on. Get them to sign something that has a hash that's smooth. And now they've signed the smooth value for you. You do enough of those. Remember index calculus, you can do some Gaussian elimination and so on, modulo E. Now you have figured out all of the primes signatures. And then you go ahead and choose the message you actually want to be signed, do enough times until it too has a smooth number, and you're done. So with all that in mind, that's why those FFs are there, because now you're dealing with something the same size of the modulus. And if you're successful enough at being able to generate things that are smooth with respect to the modulus, you basically can factor the modulus with that effort. So it brought the level of complexity up. That's where the fixed padding came from. The block type came from the idea that this looked like a block cipher. So again, in the mindset of early 90s, well, it's a block, even though it really isn't a block because it's a value that's between 0 and n-1, not a fully round number of bits. And we put the 0, 1 in it at that point, just to say this is the first block type you can have. At some point along the way, decrypt changed to encrypt. I looked back in the documents and I asked a couple of colleagues who were working on that. John Lynn was with Digital Equipment Corporation. Chris Mitchell was a researcher, continues to be a researcher working in the area, and published about this. And they helped me see a number of references where there was a switch from decrypt to encrypt and from secret key to private key. I think the secret key and private key went back and forth. Does it still go back and forth today, whether you're using a secret key in conjunction with your public key or a secret key all symmetric at this point? But that was back and forth in terms of what language you were more comfortable with. But the encrypt-decrypt switched most prominently in the X509 specification. And this is partly motivated by the idea that it was better to keep your signing separate from your encryption. and not try to do the same thing with the same key. There were even times, I think up till the mid-90s, that you used the same key for both until we got key separation around this. So this was starting to move things apart, and then it just didn't make sense to decrypt something that you never would have encrypted result in the first place. So that word encrypt changed there. But then we came up with this Encrypted Digest at the end. So I'm looking back at PKCS 1 and PKCS 7. And to conclude this elaborate signature process, not with the signature, but with an encrypted digest. Well, that's what the output was. But that didn't hold up for very long when NIST's digital signature standard came along. It didn't have an encrypted digest anymore because you couldn't decrypt it. In this case, you could take your signature and your hash and determine if they're consistent, but you were no longer recovering the hash or the formatted padded block from your signature, so it didn't make sense to call it encrypted digest. And when PKCS 7, which is the overall message syntax, went into the cryptographic message syntax through standardization, those words were changed. So we're finally back where I showed you on the first slide. We have signing and verifying, but the specifications show some of the archaeology for where we had it at that point. So this was the first of the major parts. I'll get into encryption in a moment. The specification circa 1991 has remained in deployment for years since then. It was good enough, and I'll come back to that in points later on, even though it could be better. If I waited a few more years...
What was the changes? PKCS 1 had updates.
The PKCS continued to update, and other standards went along. That's correct. And other things were added into the specification. So, but it was a few years later that Bellary and Ragois published their full domain hash that said just get a better security proof out of this. And then there was the provable signature scheme, PSS. And so they had some very good designs that were better from a security perspective, but they came just a little bit too late for this because it was deployed and working. And just last year, some researchers had a security proof for PKCS 1 version 1.5 format, finally, under certain other standards, other assumptions about the RSA problem. So I'll move then from there, and if you just accumulate some questions, we can come back to this at the end. So similar story on RSA encryption. Again, going back to the original papers, you'd have a message, you encrypt with the public key to get a ciphertext. That message, of course, would be fixed size. In fact, look in the RSA paper, you'll see an example where they imagined that every word of a communication, every spoken word of a voice communication was encrypted individually. So why not? If you have the device available to you that does the encryption, then someone else does the decryption. So they were thinking of this in a very block-oriented sense. But you'd have some issues with efficiency in that. We ultimately came up with a model using PKCS 1 and 7 in 1991 that has a hybrid mode, and I'll show you where those things fit together. Okay, so the first significant change was that the encryption on the message as a whole was with a symmetric key. And that would produce the ciphertext. The symmetric key then was going to be encrypted with the RSA public key. And again, we have a familiar looking format similar to the other ones. And at least in this case, we had plenty of symmetric key algorithms to choose from. We had DES. Okay, so we had one symmetric key algorithm to choose from at that point. But that was better than the situation with hash functions. So with that one symmetric key algorithm now, we could fit that into a block that's input to the RSA operation. And these symmetric keys were 56 bits DES fitting in a 64-bit block, or you had triple DES, so 128-bit long key. Depending on which mode of specification for triple DES, whether you were doing the same key at the beginning end or the one in the middle, three key or two key. So that would fit into the beginning. And then what else did you need to put in there? So you're putting your key in, random non-zero padding on the other side. So here we're back to the multiplicative properties, but in a more subtle way. So, well, even before we get to the multiplicative properties, if your key is significantly shorter than your modulus and your public exponent is small, which was one of the design objectives for early RSA, then you might not be encrypting at all. So choose an exponent 3. Your key is 128 bits. You cube that. It's, what, 384 bits? It hasn't even gone mod n yet. So you certainly want to pad from that perspective. So you're always encrypting and involving a mod n operation. But this is where we see attacks like Hostad's attack that says, even if you've padded it, let's say you did fixed padding, if you encrypt it with 2 different moduli, well, 3 different moduli in this case, then you have enough information from Chinese remainder theorem to come back and figure out what the message is. So these linear relationships between the messages. And it's remarkable how many papers were written about the formatting and padding, and you do put a constant value over here. Should you put it on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side? But remember the era that we're coming out of, symmetric key cryptography with all of its padding rules and where do you place these. And block ciphers were designed so it didn't really matter where you put the padding. RSA had special properties. These mathematical relationships, which are so beautifully applied now, became a difficulty when you're trying to fit the old concepts. So where we arrived out of that is that you should pad every encryption with a different set of random non-zero values. And you'll note that that actually does say non-zero. You could not have a 0 in the padding. I don't know if implementations respect that or not. They might do just random entirely. But this is, again, this padding motivation with the zeros at the other side as a delimiter. You wanted to know where the padding ended and where the key began, because after all, you might not know how long the key was, with all the flexibility that's being done. I don't recall why there's no algorithm identifier in this case, and there was no attack based on substituting one algorithm or another in this model, but we didn't maintain some symmetry in the same way. And then you have the block type number 2 that went in. Yes?
So how come at the time you were not at all concerned about data integrity, that someone modifying ciphertext to transit?
So good question, Dan. So we were not even concerned really about chosen ciphertext attacks at this point. And the model we had in mind, and this leads to some other design questions, was that we were enabling secure email. And so that idea was, well, you send someone a secure email, either they can decrypt it or they don't. If they can't decrypt it, you might find out at some later point that they couldn't decrypt it. And so we weren't imagining that there's an Oracle access where someone is constantly receiving emails that they're decrypting in real time, and we'd see what happened. And that led to a number of attacks, including the Bleikenbacher-Millian message attack on this. So it was a non-design goal, which could be complicated later on if you're trying to reuse this structure for some other purpose. Good. So similar to the signature case, this got widely adopted. It was the basis for SSL encryption early on. And SSL had some protections against the attacks that Dan was alluding to, because you'd have to prove your knowledge of the key that was being encrypted. And so that made it more difficult to complete the attack. But that didn't eliminate attacks entirely. And there were, as I mentioned, this Bleikenbacher attack based on knowledge of errors occurring during the decryption process. I throw you something, see what happens. And if we're not in the email case anymore, and I actually can get a response because you're a server now and you're going to decrypt something online, what's the error response I get that can help me to find out whether it failed because the 02 wasn't in the right place, which means I've turned you into a decryption oracle that can tell me whether certain bits have certain values in the decryption or not based on the error messages you send me. So that led to a whole lot of security guidance in the specification, saying don't do it this way, don't do it this way. Be very careful about what you reveal about the reasons that these things break. Okay, good. All right, so let me move on just to some lessons learned about standardizing cryptography, and then we can have to open some questions. So the first lesson I'd say I learned, and this, I don't know if I learned this at the time, but it's in hindsight looking at what actually worked. You need this well-balanced paradigm. So, and what are we balancing? Well, obviously you have to have sufficient level of security. and you need efficiency. And in listening to the talks here, it's a lot of emphasis on getting the security proofs. What are the assumptions you have in place? And then there's efficiency, and it's remarkable. Every time someone comes to the next generation of capabilities, they're making it the logarithm of the amount of time it took last time, something like that, just getting more and more efficient. But there's a third part I realized looking back, and that's deployability. So somehow these specifications have to be in a way that a lot of users, or at least a lot of developers, can implement and interoperate. So you need to have a minimum amount of security. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to reach some threshold, minimum amount of efficiency. But there's also a minimum amount of deployability. And because I trained as a cryptographer, I would tend to emphasize the security over everything else and keep trying to get better and better, although you might question that in looking at some of the design decisions, but did the best we could do at that point in time. But pushing the security forward, and then as an implementer, I'd push the efficiency forward. But I recognize that we actually were doing, with convening these representatives of the early adopters of public-key cryptography, we were pushing the deployability forward. We're putting it in terms that others could understand and implement. So reducing some of that complexity, having fewer moving parts, having more flexibility. You could change the hash algorithm. You didn't have to be concerned about the other hash algorithms that you'd already implemented. Those kinds of considerations made it easier for someone just to put it out there. And so that balance of the three was particularly important. It's also important in that paradigm to recognize the role that your technology is playing in the solution. So we weren't trying to do everything with public key. It would be possible to have a fully public key system, meaning that we didn't have to have any other underlying components. You just put everything into the input to an RSA operation. But that wasn't the best solution. There were some efficiency reasons for that, and careful design that you'd have to do, and so on. So you said, what's the place where public key makes the difference? Well, that's establishing symmetric keys, or that's authenticating hashes of messages. And the rest you're doing non-public key. And I imagine that there are similar considerations you go through in saying, where do we do zero-knowledge proofs? So where do we use this component? Earlier discussion on where do we use Merkle trees versus accumulators versus something else. So what's the appropriate place for each one of these? And even from perspective of what your product is, sometimes people don't need all of the public key capabilities, but they do need some of the building blocks, and then you can add the public key later on. And that goes to a question of building blocks. Which things do you need to develop? So obviously the RSA algorithm was the foundational contribution that Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman make. The company started on it. But Ron Rivest went on to invent other algorithms that were just as significant in terms of this deployment question. So this was the MD series. We needed message digest, so MD2, and then later MD4 and 5, with all the caveats that these might be close to the edge in terms of cryptanalysis, and that was the foundation for SHA-1 and that whole series that followed. And then on the encryption side, although the data encryption standard was available, at the time it was not generally exportable. That was under US export laws of the 1980s and 90s. And so for customers who wanted to have something more flexible, Ron invented another algorithm, the RC series. So there was a RC2 and an RC4, and these had variable key sizes, and these also were optimized for the microprocessors of the day. And could get some of the efficiency objectives. So that met the objectives he was looking for. Had to put these building blocks together and make things work. But you have to watch for your connection issues, because now that you're going down this road of having one algorithm connect to another algorithm, another one, and again, in the discussion earlier, I heard about how do you translate from this proof apparatus to this one. Well, those connections are unavoidable because you don't get everything built all at once. People build different parts, and then you build a bridge between the parts. And the connections means you have slightly different assumptions in the different places. You've got to make sure you're paying attention to that. And things that can break in those interconnections. So one of those was, I think, another Bleikenbacher attack, who was very good at coming up with these things. When we're connecting the ASN1 syntax into the signatures, you observe that some people were just parsing the ASN1 that was there regardless whether there was anything after it in the modulus block. So they look at the padding, all the FFs, look at the delimiter 0, and then parse the ASN1, because we're trying to connect between the ASN1 specs for all this algorithm agility. And if they did a successful ASN1 parse, they ignored the rest. And so Bleikenbacher said, well, if they're ignoring the rest of the block after that, then I can put whatever I want in the rest of the block, and I can make the block, therefore, a perfect cube if I want to. If E equals 3, just stick some things at the end, nobody's paying attention to them. So that interconnection between the block format in this implementation was a place that it would fail. Now, all you really needed to do is check that your ASN1 took up the rest of the block, and you'd be done. But if you missed that one point, an entire new attack opens up. So that's an invitation for anyone who wants to write a research paper. Just look at interconnections between the different schemes and figure out where they went wrong, either theoretically or practically, because it's necessary to make those connections. Next, check for changes in assumptions. Going back to Dan's question a moment ago, well, why didn't you think about integrity protection or plain text awareness and so on? We had a certain model that we had in mind. We weren't going to pad things any differently or add any integrity protection. Didn't have the practical apparatus for doing that at the time compared to just encrypting with the padding. But then the assumptions would change. So now we're on an online scenario. And now the signer or the decryptor is going to give you Oracle access, in effect. And so you've got to watch those things, and people who were watching them were able to see where those attacks might come up. And finally, reviewing and repeating. So this is a continuous iteration process. Once you've got something that works, you keep going back, and eventually these things become a building block in somebody else's system that they're going to extend it on. So this is a very brief summary, I hope, of what took place in spring of 1991, as folks were getting together in winter and spring and putting together early specs that were published in bound volumes and then eventually got put into IETF documents and implemented and then tested and have stood the test of time out of that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions from that if I'm useful here about how this all came together and some other perspectives that might be helpful to you. Okay.
So you gave a lot of technical details about how the standard evolved. I was wondering, looking at this, first of all, like how often did you break backward compatibility? Did you feel comfortable doing this? You know, at some point there are way too many systems out there built on these things. It becomes a little bit scarier. On the other hand, you have, as you said, changing models of attack, threat models, and so on.
So to answer the question, how often we break backward compatibility, in very few cases and intentionally we broke. We tried to keep as much of the building blocks as we could, and partly because at the time there were other specifications like the X509 certificate format or privacy enhanced mail. So with those limited number of implementations, we wanted to be sure they were capable of transitioning to the approach, but where necessary, we'd make a break. The format hadn't been used before, so we gave a new identifier for the format, and then there were new functions that were introduced. So we didn't have much of the version control issues that go on, or the downgrade and upgrade attacks that would happen later on, but we still were very cautious. And even there's some explanatory notes saying that, yes, this really is consistent with the X509 encrypted octet string signature macro, because we wanted to be accepted in that community.
And maybe before I let other people ask questions, could you maybe say something about how the standard was externally received, how it helped, I guess, maybe convince people that all this magical math is somehow based on something that they can trust, and whether or not this was at all helpful?
It was helpful to have the standard because it gave a common reference for any of the implementers, whether they were using the tools that the RSA Data Security offered or they're building something on their own based on other implementations. So having those common references meant that we knew what we were talking about, and then we could therefore analyze a specific target. So that's embodying the concepts that were in a number of research papers, saying these are the ones that we've selected. That was helpful. Also, because there were implementations now that reflected the specifications. One was the non-commercial code that RSA Data Security released called RSA Ref. And so if people knew that they were on the same platform, at least that would limit the number of things that they needed to analyze. We had buy-in from early adopters of the technology. A number of those are listed in early specifications that they were at these meetings in February and in March of 1991. And so they effectively were co-authors of the process. So they had a stake in ensuring it was something they could sell within their companies. And once they did that with the implementations, then they had this interoperability vision that would be fulfilled.
All right. So I'll open the floor for questions.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a bunch here.
Rather silly question.
Yeah.
I know you talked about PKCS 7.
Right.
Are we curious what made you go from PKCS 7 to 12?
So in terms of the sequence of numbers or in terms of the
It's with index. It's like slight difference in paradigm.
Oh, the difference in paradigm. So by the time 12 came along, and this was the format for moving the your say personal credentials from one platform to another. That was a good example of the community coming back with a working implementation or problem statement and coming through the PKCS process. So the other ones were generally driven out of the technology vendor, saying we've got some solutions we're trying to push out to the community. 12 was a good example where the community said we've got a problem and a solution, we're trying to push that back among all the other adopters of the other specifications.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I want to ask about compliance. So how long did it take before a enterprise clients not only implemented RSA, but actually adopted it for compliance? For tasks that require compliance, like for example, as an alternative to sending a messenger in a locked box with a paper in it. So before they could tell possible regulators that yes, we did everything, trust us, it's okay. And how did you finally convince them to use this for compliant tasks?
Good question. So thinking of compliance, that will depend on which industry the company is and what regulations they're subject to. And so you could say, as an example, if you're in the banking industry, there were banking specifications, the X9.31 and later X9.44 series. This is for US banks. So if you need to conform with a certain way of doing key management, once those standards were in place, you could certify that you met the standards. With US government uses with the FIPS series as those specifications, so FIPS 186, it added these in and the security modules in FIPS 140. So you'd have to look for the arrival of appropriate specifications for the particular parts of the market. And so I'm not sure how long that took in either place. But oftentimes interoperability was the driver. So if you have protocols like SSL that implement these technologies in different parts of public key infrastructure, then you're using it whether it's a compliance drive or not, because it's an available solution that you consider good enough for your business purpose, and then the compliance will catch up with it.
Hey, Burt. Great talk. So Jim beats us in his talk mentioned the RSA challenge numbers.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how those numbers were generated since you were involved, and also is the factorization written anywhere or is that gone? And I'm not just asking this for curiosity. There's like an interest in using those numbers as numbers for which nobody knows the factorization.
So the RSA factoring challenge numbers, to the best of my recollection, were designed in such a way that even RSA did not know the factors. So the idea of generating them, multiplying them together, destroying the factors, so that we could plausibly say that we don't have any inside information on what the results should be. And there was some debate back at the beginning about whether it was useful from a scientific perspective to have people factor numbers whose factorizations were already known, at least known in principle because they had been multiplied together beforehand. And if you look back at the early factoring challenge, there was another series of numbers. These are the partition numbers that were included, whose factorizations presumably were not known because these occurred out of number theoretic constructions. And so some people targeted the partition numbers instead to do a better contribution to learning new things about how to factor. But that, in that story, I don't believe you'll be able to find any of those original factors other than by factoring the numbers yourself. How was it generated? Generation, again, to best of my recollection at the time, was on a PC with software that RSA had developed in a secure facility. So in a SCIF someplace, right, with the Faraday cage around us so there'd be no emanations. I later did some generations with this in someone's car using that Faraday cage as the protection against electromagnetic emanations. So we're safe.
So one of the things that was really interesting about your talk was this kind of like, oh, well, here's this decision that we made, and right. You know, why was it like this? Well, that was only discovered a few years later. Right. But I guess maybe this is a hard question to answer, but even taking into account that kind of like the things that were not yet known, right. Do you have an idea of like what would be like the biggest thing that you think could have gone better in retrospect? So and
I come back and think about what would we have done differently if we're trying to get a certain goal in mind. So, but let's say at the time the goal was getting interoperability with specifications that were good enough, and then figuring that over time we could make the specifications better. There was an open invitation in this process to continue to innovate. There's a force that works against you. Once you're successful, you're kind of stuck with the code that you have, and you have to keep building and improving around that, and so you find other ways besides getting the core concepts together. I think in hindsight, if we could have looked at the problems we were trying to solve and the tools that we had available, we might have come to a different conclusion in two ways. So one, Shoup later on, Victor Shoup later on came up with this use of RSA KEM, the key encapsulation methods, and it said, don't do any formatting and padding. The best thing that RSA is at doing is encrypting something random. So just choose a random number, encrypt the random number, and then derive your key from the random number, or from the random number in the ciphertext, depending on your model. And you can get very strong security proofs around that. But that means that you'd have something else going on in addition to transporting a message or a key, because we're still coming out of the mindset that the purpose of RSA was to transport something, which could be a message, it could be a key. That was a mental block, at least for me, in the process. So, but RSA worked beautifully for the others. Similarly, for things like full domain hashing, you could say, consider the RSA is great at signing a random number, so why don't we represent the message as a random number, or maybe use some of the Bellary-Ragway provable signature scheme with a randomizer going in and so on. But then at the time, we thought there were cases where we were wanting to sign the message. So therefore, we had a block that could either handle a message or handle the message digest. So I think looking back on it, if we had a more clear sense of what it would actually need to be used for, as opposed to what it might be used for. But then maybe we couldn't have sold it if it didn't have both of those flexibilities, because some people wanted to be able to do just messages. And so it says, I don't look back and think we should have done anything different. It was just good that we kept paying attention. I am glad that Ron Rivest pointed out that Desmet-Olitzko attack early on, that put that one in the design, that kept us ahead. We could have followed also Dorothy Denning's suggestion to make multiple copies of the hash with maybe some variants of padding and so on, if that would break the multiplicative structure. So I think we got that one right. Good. What else? How much more time do we have?
Yeah, I think tacking on the kind of a similar question, I think one of the I feel like in this community, one of the oppositions to standards are that it will stifle innovation in some way. Like, do you feel like with, say, the RSA standard, like, do you feel like this has been a problem, or did this like delay the rise of elliptic curve cryptography? And I guess very similar as you were saying now, what things can be done to still be open while standardizing what is out there? Right. So I see standardization not as stifling innovation, but rather as shifting it. And so once you, and this is a community decision, so it's not one company deciding now we have the standard. It's a community reaching a point saying, we're going to stick with this stable specification, we'll interoperate around it. That means two things happen once you've done that. One, you get innovation in the implementations, because now we have a common interface that we're all working from, so we can all work down to the best way that we think that we can implement that more efficient and more secure from other kinds of attacks. So the innovation shifts there. The innovation also then shifts up to the applications. So if you're not thinking so much about what the building block is, now you can say, let me think about how I'm going to use the building block, because I know the building block won't change. And one case where we saw that happening is with the PKCS 7 specification being algorithm independent, especially when it moved into the cryptographic message syntax. And so at that point, it could support RSA or elliptic curve or other specs. They all hook together the same way, and other standards efforts would then emerge. So it's just a matter of where the shift occurs. But you'd want to welcome that point where you'd say, we're done with this. It's good enough. It meets that triangle of being secure enough, efficient enough, and deployable enough. We can move on to the next thing, because that's ultimately where you're going to go to bring the value to the customers and the problems you're trying to solve for them. So, thank you.
All right.